It's time for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Well, the federal budget is on the horizon, and so what better time than now to discuss Canada's fiscal and economic challenges, again with Kevin Page, who is Canada's former Parliamentary Budget Officer. Kevin now is heading up the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Welcome back to the show.
Good to be on the show, Tony.
Well, before we get to the budget, and that's a whole can of worms, I know, I did want to get your take on the current economic and fiscal situation for Canada. Recently, we just had the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report, but you may want to comment on that. But certainly, generally, how are we looking?
Well, actually, Tony, I'm just thinking of the title of your program, Boom and Bust. And maybe if we turned it around, it would be Bust and Boom. Certainly, today was kind of a big day. We got numbers from Statistics Canada on the GDP outlook, or the GDP numbers for January. So we have a sense of just how weak the economy is and how far we have to go to get back to where we were in a pre-COVID environment. And we saw a release of the PBO report, as you alluded to, which provided an updated forecast. In addition, we got some numbers yesterday from the conference board. So I think like the sense right now, Tony, is that the economy, as we look at it right now, is still quite weak. So again, if you look at those January GDP numbers, we're down just a little under 3% on a year-over-year basis. So like that's a pretty weak economy, not unlike the kind of economy you faced in the 2000 financial crisis, where we saw an annual decline of about 3.5%. In 2009. And if you look at the labor market, Tony, the numbers, are right now, and just in terms of employment, we're down about 600,000 jobs, from where we were last February. That's on a total employment number of about, 19 million. So that's a significant hole that we need to make up. Both the PBO, Tony, and the conference board are saying good times are ahead. So we're going to see the boom after the bust in 2021. They're both projecting growth, north of 5% real GDP, which is quite strong in terms of the rebound. And, again, I think there's a lot of hope that if we can vaccinate people, that growth will come back, though I still think there's a lot of uncertainty around those numbers.
Again, the Parliamentary Budget Officer said that the current deficit that he is projecting is $363 billion. So any commentary on that?
Yeah, it's obviously a record deficit, as a percentage of GDP. Tony, it's about 16.5%. So we've never seen anything, it's more than twice bigger than any deficit we had in the early 80s or early 90s, or in the 2009 financial crisis. That number is expected, that PBO thinks that number can come down to about $120 billion pre-stimulus. That would be about 5 percentage points of GDP. And then we start to see numbers that look a little bit more familiar, 2022, 23 in these forecasts, which would be, roughly around, deficits in the $40 billion range, kind of back down to kind of less than 2 percentage points of GDP. So it's kind of a little bit of a return to normalcy. But again, that's pre-stimulus.
Right. And we will get to that. I promise you, I just want to sort of set the table a little bit. In the minute and a half we have before the first break, just talk a little bit about some of our short-term challenges. It really does depend on vaccination, I'm presuming, and getting a better level of vaccination in the country.
Yeah, so we're definitely behind other countries when it comes, to the rollout of vaccination, and we're seeing spikes, in the infection rates. Certainly in Ontario, which is I think is going to is hurting growth. Will hurt growth certainly in the service sector. So yeah, it's a hard time to put together a budget. Again, you're kind of you're thinking about recovery, but you're still providing important relief to big sectors, particularly service sectors that are really shut down. And again, you want to create the confidence about that strong recovery that PBO and Conference Board and others are saying is going to come. And again, I think the government, thinking about elections, probably thinking about like what comes after the recovery in terms of its some of its earlier policy commitments.
We're speaking with Kevin Page. He is formerly Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer, now heading up the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. setting the table for the federal budget, which is coming out on April the 19th. We'll be right back after this break. Please stay with us. Kevin, again, before we get to the budget, I did want to get your take. We've had a number of provincial budgets that have been released in the last few weeks, most notably, of course, the budget in Ontario. Does that provide any kind of roadmap on how Canadian governments writ large are dealing with the challenges that you outlined in the first part of this interview?
Yeah, so yeah, we've seen just like last week, we saw budgets in Ontario and Quebec. And I mean, I think certainly in the Ontario budget, which I spent a bit more time looking at, you could see that, I mean, the government, again, wants to provide, make sure that there's enough relief, certainly, and support for the health sector. And really not in a position to talk about, really getting back to balance, although, I mean, there's a longer term projection in Ontario budget over the next 10 years saying that they could get back to balance in a 10-year period of time. Very high levels of debt that are generated in in the pandemic period. I think they're really not prepared to kind of deal with that issue in any significant way. It's just too early. So I think, but I feel a little bit sympathetic for the provinces, Tony, that again they're having to go out ahead of the federal government with respect to their budgets. And I'm waiting to see. And one of the big issues, of course, will be what will happen to federal transfers. Federal transfers were a very significant part of the fiscal support in 2020 for the provinces. They don't really know. There's been some hints that the federal government would entertain higher transfers, particularly for healthcare. But again, that remains to be seen. And again, the whole issue of stimulus, I don't think, like certainly in the case of Ontario, really not prepared to really talk about any kind of significant stimulus. So I think again, they're looking for the federal government to provide that that stimulus that you see lots of talk in the United States and Europe in the current environment.
All right, we're finally to the topic at hand, which is the federal budget. You've been alluding to it already, but it's due out April the 19th. Of course, it's a couple of weeks away at this point. What should we be looking for in that federal budget, and what does that tell us about the government's strategy on the issues?
Yeah, so I think people, I mean, these numbers that we've already started talking about, Tony, like how strong could the economy be? How big could this bounce back be in 2021? That's going to be front and center of the budget. Like, do we really need stimulus? How much stimulus do we need? What should be like, the nature of the package of stimulus? In the fall economic statement released, late last year, Minister Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, like talked about stimulus in the $70 to $100 billion range over 3 years, which I think proportionally, Tony, would be kind of the stimulus that you brought in when you were cabinet minister in 2009 and 10, and that sort of percentage of GDP range. And again, that was in a context of an economy they thought wouldn't have as strong a bounce back as we've seen in these latest numbers from the Parliamentary Budget Office and from the Conference Board. So yeah, I think a lot of it will be on the recovery, and like what would be what are those policy supports that they think that the country needs to kind of jumpstart the economy. And again, these bigger growth numbers that we're seeing in 2021, it's really in the context of a very weak 2020 economy. So again, we're really just trying to get back to where we were in February of last year when COVID really hit. We'll still be $100 billion or $200 billion below where the government said we could be in the fall of 2019 in a kind of a pre-COVID track. So yeah, what are those? How big will this package be? How will they implement these guardrails? How do you balance kind of the consumption versus investment in a stimulus package? I think these are some big challenges for the recovery part of that budget.
Yeah, you're echoing something that the Parliamentary Budget Officer also paid heed to, that there could be an opportunity or a situation where you're putting too much stimulus in, given the rate of potential recovery. And I guess the other side of the coin, getting into monetary policy a little bit, is the threat of inflation. Are those the issues?
Yeah, those are big issues. Like I think the forecast that we saw, I think from the conference board and the PBO, it's kind of a Goldilocks scenario, Tony. I think it's they don't really, they're not foreseeing any significant spike in inflation, notwithstanding these, incredible fiscal supports and monetary policy accommodation. Interest rates climb, but really very, very small, mostly on the long-term side on the 10-year government bond yields. So it's again, that would be a scenario that if you're a finance minister, you would love to have.
Sure.
I still think, like, again, if you go back to these guardrails and Minister Freeland talking about using the labor market provide the guardrails, as I noted, like, we're 600,000 jobs less than where we were last
Sure.
February.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust here with Kevin Page, Canada's former parliamentary budget officer, heading up the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Kevin, my next question might be a bit unfair to ask. I've been dancing around some of this. You're a fiscal studies expert, but I'd love to get your take on modern monetary theory. Does that obviously, the idea is to create money to power fiscal policy. Have you done any studying of this, and do you have any comments on it?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think the financial markets, analysts really around the world are looking at the way the government debt is being put onto central bank balance sheets. We've seen enormous expansion we've seen of the balance sheet of the central banks, really in Canada, but across the world. So a significant part of the increase in the debt, and it is enormous, has been put on the Bank of Canada is putting on its sheet, in addition to a lot of provincial bonds and some commercial paper. So again, it's putting less pressure on the financial markets in order to sell this debt. And again, I think it's, in terms of, the modern financial monetary sort of theory, it's really based upon, like, we could pretty much continue along these lines until inflation becomes a problem. And I think, like, right now, I mean, a pandemic is very deflationary.
Right.
So, I think the CPI and that it's for the most part, it's, the growth on a year-over-year basis about 1.5%. But you can definitely see signs that spikes in prices, certainly in the housing sector. You could see it in the commodity prices, particularly like in the forestry side, which is, again, more construction related. And again, if you look at wages and salaries, notwithstanding the fact that we have a fairly weak labor market, average annual earnings are growing, 4 or 5%. So I think this is, again, we have to monitor this, and it's so even the modern, the monetaristic kind of thinking that we can continue to do this. Inflation is always out there. I started Department of Finance in early 1980s.
Right.
I was the inflation analyst, and inflation was, as you recall, it was in the 13% range, and interest rates were north of that. So, like, it could happen because we just have extraordinary monetary and fiscal policy expansion going on right now.
Well, certainly there's a whole generation of folks in Canada that have never seen real inflation like it was back in the early 80s. So hopefully we don't have a recurrence of that. I'd love to get your take, getting back to the budget for a second, get your take on where you think taxation policy is going.
Yeah, so we've seen some international budgets, Tony. Like, we saw the UK budget a few weeks ago, where the treasurer kind of signaled that continual fiscal supports over the next couple of years, but again, a commitment to pay that back with higher corporate income taxes. I think again, we're seeing the signals coming out of the United States right now, particularly with with Mr. Biden's infrastructure package, that he's prepared to finance that over a longer period of time with increases in corporate income taxes as well, and potentially like higher progressive income taxes to pay for some of those transfers to individuals as well. So I think the pressure probably more in the medium term about, like, how do we pay for this big spike in debt that we've seen in Europe and United States, and certainly in Canada as well. So I don't know how much the government will signal that in the budget, but it could become a big an election issue if we were to see an election come this fall.
Do you see any immediate taxation increases? Is that something we should look for in the budget?
Yeah, there's certainly talk about there's some interesting op-eds in the recent days, including some from MPs that talk about the need to tax wealth. Maybe a one-time tax. The member of Parliament from the Toronto Beaches, Mr. Erskine Smith, has talked about that. So I think that's a possibility. I think the government has signaled it would like to start find better ways to tax, e-commerce, where we've seen some pretty
Right.
significant growth in profits. There's a lot of international coordination work that needs to go on there, but again, we could see more signaling of those kinds of revenues, but that's not really going to pay for the kind of the big spike that we've seen in debt over the past year or two. And I think the government's going to be pretty careful. There's still there's still a lot of uncertainty about this recovery, even notwithstanding some of these good numbers from PBO and the conference board. Now is not really a good time to start increasing taxes. Certainly on the general population. But yeah, again, could there be some temptation to tax wealth? I think so.
Interesting. We are speaking with Kevin Page. He was Canada's former parliamentary budget officer, now heading up the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. We will continue that discussion after this break. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust, continuing my discussion with Kevin Page. Kevin, you did mention this, but I want to just unpack it a little bit. Recently, you've been sounding the alarm about government debt. Obviously, this is a huge factor, or maybe not. It's so hard to discuss debt because it's at levels that none of us have ever been used to before. So again, walk us through what you think is a sustainable scenario and maybe what is an unsustainable scenario.
Yeah. So when economists, the PBO does this fiscal sustainability work, so does the IMF and the Department of Finance. They do these long-term projections. They'll look at the fiscal structure of a country like Canada, its income taxes, or sorry, its tax revenues, its spending structure, and then they will do these sort of longer-term projections, some reasonable assumptions for growth. And again, in the context of an aging demographic kind of population, and I think when they do the analysis right now, I think there's kind of a sense that we could stabilize debt relative to income in Canada, but at a much higher level. Again, I think the numbers that we saw in PBO, we're talking about federal debt to GDP ratios around 50%. That's about 20 percentage points higher than where we were going into COVID, so a much higher debt level. But again, we could stabilize debt relative to income over the long run. We'll still see some increases in debt in the next few years, but overall, it's not a long-term problem. Certainly, in a number of provinces, Tony, some of the bigger provinces, some of the less wealthy provinces as well. There's some fiscal sustainability issues, particularly, in part because of aging demographics and healthcare. So, I mean, overall, like we have this vertical fiscal imbalance. So we have to be mindful of the fact that there's a big squeeze on in provinces. It's going to be difficult for them to get their debt numbers down, and municipalities are hurting as well. So, I mean, I think the feds know that there's a lot of pressure for them to carry the weight if there is going to be stimulus over the next few years. So, yeah, there are other countries like the United States that don't look fiscally sustainable. There's, certainly a lot of problems in European economies that don't look fiscally sustainable as well. So debt rises relative to income. But Canada, at least at the federal level, we are stable, but at a much higher debt level.
Do you think that governments can grow their way out of some of these debt issues? Is that a possibility for Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, certainly, I think as we look to the kind of stimulus package that we want, getting the right balance between stuff like, that is consumption orientated. When, your government Tony was putting together stimulus 2009 and 10, I think the government did a great job. It was really trying to close an output gap, a weak economy, get money into hands of people, move forward at some infrastructure. I think now, as we kind of look forward, it's like, can we really boost potential growth rates? Can we help the economy make some of these big adjustments with respect to getting to zero net emissions, where many countries, including Canada, have commitments for 2050? So again, it's about, can we boost some of these potential growth rates, which would result in higher revenues. In the UK budget, there was focus on innovation, there was focus on job training and on infrastructure. And those could be potential themes that we could see in the Canadian budget. But that is really more about growing the long-term potential growth rate that will allow us to kind of at least bring some downward pressure on these debt to GDP ratios.
Do you think that are you getting a sense from your work at the Institute that Canadians are getting more concerned about these fiscal issues?
Yeah, I think the numbers that I've seen, Tony, from some of the big polling firms, including Ecos, is it's not front and center right
Right.
now from a Canadian perspective. Again, I'm sure the bond rating agencies are going to be looking hard at these fiscal planning frameworks. Are there fiscal anchors? Are these guardrails really going to bite? Are there real budgetary constraints? But yeah, I think Canada right now, if you look at least, if you look at our net debt, gross liabilities less financial assets, and you look at relative to our income, we're still way better off than many European economies and the United States. And that's, thanks to a lot of work done in the 1990s and early 2000s, including your government, Tony, that brought us back to balance in 2014-15.
Kevin Page, it's great to have you on the program once again to get your advice and your analysis as we go into budget time, and we'll be looking very forward to having you back on in the future as well. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Tony.
Well, you heard it from Kevin Page. There's a lot to look at and about when it comes to the next federal budget on April 19th. A lot of issues are regarding inflation, taxes, deficits, debt, spending, infrastructure, stimulus, a lot going on, and we are going to continue to follow this story, believe me, in the weeks ahead. Please stay with us.